Hey Dave, thanks for the introduction. And hi everyone. My name is Emile Cabot, and I am an MVP in Cloud and Data Center Management based out of Calgary, Canada. Today's session is going to look at the process for migrating an enterprise from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory using tools that are available to us in 2021. So from a high level, we've done a few of these over the last couple of years where we've either moved organizations from their on-prem AD to AAD only, or we took a couple of new mid-sized businesses and architected a full environment that was 100% Azure-based. And despite all of the blogs that you read out there, it is possible you can do it. Um, but it's not a like for like comparison, right? It's not apples to apples. Active Directory is so much more than just user authentication and groups. There's a plethora of roles that we have deployed and utilized and relied on for years. And these services are not only critical to the organization, but also to the security implementation of our operating environment. So when you're looking at migrating from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory, you're not just thinking about users and groups and where those reside. There's all of these other components that go in behind that we're now going to have to figure out. Right, so we've got login scripts. A lot of people still use login scripts and kick scripts. We've got map drives. We've got group policy objects. We've got OU memberships and OU targeted policies. We've got site targeted policies. We've got, and then the Active Directory roles, right? We've got DNS. We've got DHCP, we've got certificate services, we've got direct access, right? We've got VPN. There's a whole plethora of them. And in reality, as we go through and start to look at this transition from AD to AAD, really what we're doing is we're migrating to the modern desktop. And one of the biggest problems that you'll come across when you try to do this transition is grasping onto those legacy management practices and trying to find a way to force that same policy through into the modern desktop. So before we go further, the question will arise with some of you as to what is a modern desktop. And the modern desktop is not a technology, it's more of a framework and a way of thinking of managing the tools. It takes into consideration what's most important for the end user, what's most important for management, and what's most important for security, and provides that level of control without the extra complexity and restriction that's not necessary. We want to make the experience as beneficial for the end user as possible, and we want to drive adoption. We want to make sure that when they're using these tools, it's easy for them, they're comfortable with them, and it's engaging. So modern technologies like biometrics and passwordless authentication, using authenticator apps and stuff, is more than acceptable form of authentication. The reality is that a username and password is very, very vulnerable, and it's the other levels of authentication, the multi-factors, the multiple factors that are important, right? The biometric, the PIN authentication, so on and so forth. So based upon what we can do is we can assign a threat level to a device based upon how it's connecting, right? Like if a device is Intune compliant, right? That means it's enrolled in MDM and it's on a trusted network. So it's on a known location that we've defined. And the Wi-Fi profile is private, then we're fine with just the biometric authentication, and maybe a 5-minute password or a 5-minute screensaver. But if they're connecting from a private device or a personally owned device on a public location, then we may not want to give them access at all. So what we do is we define the gates, what allows people to access based upon how they're accessing. So rather than just say, no, nobody that's outside of the on-prem network can authenticate. And that's a very, very popular thing. So what people have done with like their ADFS implementation is they've prevented authentication outside of their internal network. So when you try to go log into Office 365, it's going to port you over to your ADFS server, and then you type in your password there. But if you're not on-prem, ADFS can't verify your password, and therefore it can't authenticate you and can't authorize you access into the environment. And it's an easy way to block people. In a COVID world, that doesn't work because everybody's at home and, these aren't known locations anymore. So what we now need to do is we need to make ADFS available externally, because the first thing I need to know when a connection comes through is if that user is properly authenticated, if that is in fact one of my employees. Now, once I've validated that this is in fact an employee with a valid username and password and whatever SSO or multi-factor, now I can define whether they're going to be authorized for access or not. So if they've connected externally, that's fine. Are they connecting from private machine from an Intune compliant device? Yes, okay, then I'll give them access. If they're connecting from a private network from a non-managed device, then we will only allow them access to email, for example. So it allows us to, instead of blocking the authentication, we're now controlling the authorization of access based upon where our connection is coming from. I hope that makes sense. And then we want to utilize stuff like cloud storage and OneDrive and SharePoint. We need to move away from those shared drives and map drives. We also don't want people to be storing stuff locally on their machines, at least through unknown folders, right? So with OneDrive, we can configure what's known as known folder move and automatically add any file that's added to the desktop or documents, for example, right into OneDrive. So that'll allow us to protect our corporate data, even on devices that are anywhere in the world. So when you're looking at migrating from AD to AAD, as I mentioned, one of the big things that we're going to have a problem with is group policy. The older the environment that you have, the harder this is going to be, because group policy's been around for more than 20 years. And if you haven't been using a tool like Config Manager, historically, then group policy was really the only way to get stuff out to your machines. So a good analysis of group policy needs to be undertaken. And until recently, there wasn't really a good process for that. The next thing is the AD integration. So as you're moving from this, you have AD integration through Intune, so you can automatically enroll all of your existing devices into Intune through a group policy. And this is amazing because I've found in operation that enrolling Macs and enrolling Windows is inherently different. The Apple process to enroll a device into Intune is so easy for corporate owned devices, is so easy and requires very, very little manipulation by the end user or the administrator to make it happen. From a Windows perspective, if you're autopiloting the device and you're able to capture that device and get it into Intune right from that out-of-box configuration, then it's very easy. If you don't have that and you've got an existing fleet of machines that you need to import into Intune, there's like 8 different ways to do it, and each one is inherently more convoluted than the last. And it requires a lot of different things, both from the admin side and the administrator side, to accept stuff. So the auto-enrollment capability through AD integration can't be discounted, because without it, all of the other processes aren't quite as seamless. AAD Premium, there's 2 levels, P1 and P2. P1 will get you most everything that you need to do this properly, but there are a couple of things that P2 will give you over and above, and I'll get into those in a second. So self-service groups, apps, and password reset. This is very, very important to implement as you're moving to modern desktop, because we want to be able to give the end users the capability to request both their password be changed after confirming their identity, and have the ability to self-request additions and modifications to groups and application deployments, right? As we move to that modern desktop, and especially if you have an AD that's 20 years old, you may decide to start your group memberships from fresh and base them high level at a department level and go from there. If you're going to do something like that, you really want to lighten the workload on your service desk and give some automation capabilities down to the end user and to management to self-resolve a lot of these things. Multi-factor authentication isn't actually available for anything other than Office 365 for users that don't have AAD Premium. So unless you have a third-party MFA tool today, you're definitely going to want to have P1 to get your multi-factor authentication turned on for stuff that's not in Office 365. Azure Information Protection will assign labels to your documents, so that it'll allow you to control data loss and privacy protection on those documents. So that's a very important P1 tool. Now, PIM is Privileged Identity Management, and PIM is a P2 tool. Now, what PIM will do is it will allow a user, or let's think of an administrator. It'll allow them to go into Azure and request elevated privileges for a set amount of time. That's really beneficial for this type of a migration, because all of the same Active Directory roles that we had on-prem are not going to be the same roles that we have in AAD. And a very, very perfect example is the local admins group. There is a role in Azure called the Device Local Administrators, but if you add somebody into that, you give them local admin to every workstation and Azure VM that's there. And that's definitely not what we want to do to our service desk. So we have to go through a more complex process to properly define a local workstation admins like we had traditionally done. And this goes back to my earlier point about modern desktop, where we want to kind of transition the way from where we used to do things to the modern way with the features that are available to us, without creating a bigger vulnerability. And PIM is one of those ways to do that, because we can provide admins with a privileged account that effectively has no privileges. And until they need to go and perform an action, will we go and enable those permissions. And then from a PIM perspective, the permissions are only made available for a specific amount of time. And then we'll be able to go through log analytics and view the audit trail of those activities to see what the user was doing during those elevated actions. And that will, if we can, forecast, if we can capture that and grasp that over a series of time, then what we'll be able to do is maybe build a role, a specific custom role for that user that gives them just the elevated responsibilities that they typically would need. So one of the cool things that was added in the recent months inside of Intune is this group policy analytics section. So what you can do inside of here, it's pretty neat, is you'll there's an import button right above my screenshot that's not there, and it will allow you to import your ADMX templates. And then what it'll do is it's going to do two things. So it's going to look at those group policies as they've applied onto managed workstations, and it's going to come back and it's going to give you a performance score for each of those policies, and it'll tell you the impact of the device or the impact of the policy on that device, which is really neat. Now, the other thing that they've added in here is over on the right of the screenshot, you see CSP name and CSP mapping. Now, this is cool. So what they've done is now when you import the policy into Intune, it will tell you whether it's MDM compliant or not. And that's the second column there where you see the yeses and the one no. That says whether the policy, there's a corresponding policy in Intune already for that setting. And then it'll tell you on the far right exactly where to go to configure that setting because they don't always match up. So that's pretty neat. And this is the other side of it where they've added in. So now when you go through and create a device configuration profile for a Windows device, you're going to get two options. One is going to be settings, which is what we're looking at here. And then the other one is called templates, which was the traditional menu that we had. For policies, traditionally, our only option was to configure OMA URI settings, which is basically script-based and didn't provide us with a UI like this to go and enable and disable options. So adding this in here is huge because now what we can do, even if we're not looking at this from a migration perspective and we're happy with hybrid machines and still having AD and AAD, again, perfectly fine. What we can do is start to migrate some group policies from AD GPOs to Intune compliance or Intune configuration items. And this is very powerful because especially for computer policies, it's really hard to get those to apply on devices that are off-prem. So by migrating these settings from your on-prem AD group policy into Intune, you're going to be able to enforce compliance and ensure reduced configuration drift across the machines that don't connect into the environment very often. Okay, so next we have the on-prem servers that are left over, right? The ones that have not been migrated to Azure. You can, with Windows Server 2019, you can join them to Azure Active Directory and get them in that way. Again, as I mentioned, don't use that device local administrator role. Use PowerShell OMA URIs to configure your local admin memberships if you don't have another tool to do that. If you've still got file servers online, now's the time to start looking at a SharePoint migration. SharePoint is awesome for file servers, and the synchronization capabilities and functionalities with the OneDrive sync client pairing with SharePoint really addresses a lot of the concerns that we had with moving file servers to the cloud for years. So definitely look at SharePoint and include the feature set for OneDrive for Business when you do that analysis. For your application workloads, there's 3 or 4 different SQL options inside of Azure. You can always, do an IaaS virtual machine and then do your SQL on that. They've also got managed SQL, which is a PaaS version, or Azure SQL, which is a SaaS version, and those will ease responsibility for those SQL admins. And then if you can move your databases up there, you can move your app servers up there. For any application servers that can't get migrated up for whatever reason, there is a feature in Azure called the Azure Web Application Proxy, which will make the app URL for your app server externally accessible on the internet. And while initially that sounds scary, remember what we do is control access to that via conditional access. So through a conditional access policy, once that's published, we'll still ensure that only our corporate users are able to get in there. And then, of course, if you've still got stuff on-prem, there is an always-on VPN client that's built into Windows. It works with a plethora of third-party providers as well, and we can auto-configure that to both install, configure, and enable during the autopilot process. But in reality, from the modern desktop perspective, we want to start to get away from requiring VPN to do work. So we need to look at really why that needs to happen. So once we're up into Azure, and everything is up there, how do we manage it all? And so the first one is log analytics. Log analytics needs to be turned on all the resources. Most of them don't get turned on automatically, so you've got to go turn it on. You've also got to have a log analytics workspace created where all of this data is being saved to. Now, it is important to mention that the log analytics workspace does consume space and you are charged for it. So the more devices and the more information you have porting in the log analytics, the more expensive that cost will be. Azure Monitor will work with log analytics to provide you that full monitoring capabilities, and it utilizes that new Kusto query language to go through and create the queries for the reports that you want. So it's very, very flexible. And then finally, Azure Update is a patch solution that will keep your workstations up there updated. Coming down the line, hopefully soon, is what's SCOM managed instance. It's called Project Aquila right now, and it's effectively SCOM in Azure. And for anybody that's using SCOM today, that's awesome, because SCOM is a pretty beastie application from an infrastructure perspective, and even for small organizations of less than 1,000 seats. You still need a couple servers, right? So it's nice to see that option coming, and I'm excited to see how that interface is going to look and what the connection experience is going to be like. Now, I did show you all the cool stuff from the UI inside of the settings catalog in here. But it's important to mention that not everything that you need is in there. And even some things that Intune says is not possible is possible, just through a different way. And there's lots of cool little tweaks that we can make using OMA URI settings. And we can also manage Intune and our devices through PowerShell and connecting into them using the Graph API. So it gives us the ability to, from a command line, reach out and hit, I think it's up to 1,000 machines at a time. So that's pretty neat. And then, of course, there is still a large third-party systems management market out there that will address any little gaps that you happen to find inside of this transition process. So before you start, a couple of high-level notes. The first one is this isn't a desktop project. This is an organization transformation. If you're looking at project planning for this type of a project, you need to include all the functional groups inside of the organization. The management groups that make the operation, the day-to-day run, they need to be on board. We need to include networking and security. Believe it or not, one of the hardest things that we run into when implementing or migrating a organization from AD to AAD is port authentication and the network requirements for access. So we need to make sure that they're on board and abreast of the modern desktop and what solutions or what options will be available to us and them to configure restrictions moving forward. Equally for security, security will need to know that their compliance items and their required processes are still being adhered to once we move to this AAD only environment. And it is a new environment. There are very, very few similarities between an AD organization and an AAD organization. So you need to go through everything from onboarding to procurement to organizational changes to termination, and through all of these functional groups, and ensure that you're able to keep operations and keep the day-to-day moving under the new model. A final note on the Microsoft Fast Track program. This is a great little program Microsoft has had out for, 5 years or so now. And they will have a dedicated team work with you through the implementation process and help guide the project and assist with any potential roadblocks that occur along the way. I hope this was beneficial for everyone, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.